welcome to day 3 of Vendep SaaS Camp, where we jump into the product-led growth with Sam Richards from Openview. And my name is Jupe Arala. I'm from Vendep, and as you know, Vendep is a early stage SaaS investor, mainly investing in the Baltics and Nordics, and investing pre-Series A. So when you have already gotten your product off the ground and some revenue, that's when we are the right investor for you. But yeah, Sam, I'm handing it over to you. Take it away. The floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you. I appreciate it. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this afternoon, the day 3 of the Vendep SaaS Camp. I'm Sam Richard. I'm the VP of Growth at Openview Partners. We're based here in Boston, Massachusetts, but we invest globally. We actually coined the term product-led growth back in 2017, and it seems to have really taken off in the past 2 years. So we've been having a great time talking about it and things like that. So my role at Openview is the VP of Growth. So Openview is a little different from some VCs in that we have an entire expansion team there to support our portfolio companies. We invest a little bit later, sort of at the Series A, Series B stage, after you've found product market fit and you've got some traction. And my team's goal, the growth team's goal, is to help companies who have a really strong product and have a really strong fit to actually, find go-to-market nirvana, find go-to-market success. So we act almost as in-house consultants and researchers to help our companies and portfolio companies get off the ground and find as many users as possible. I specialize in product-led growth on the team. Product-led does not necessarily mean that we only invest in product-led businesses, but we do take best practices from product-led businesses like Calendly, like Datadog, who are in our portfolio, and we help apply them to all businesses who might need some extra help in sales marketing function or in the product function to make them more efficient and to make their product sort of take off and go viral, so to speak. So today I'm going to talk about the mechanics of what it looks like to build a product-led company. I've studied product-led companies now for many years. Prior to my role at Openview, I headed up product and customer success at a company called Dispatch, which was later acquired by private equity, where I was onboarding hundreds of thousands of service providers onto our application, only using the product itself. Every single day I get to work with product-led companies as well and speak with many different founders. So let me just give you a little bit of background. I know not everyone here is familiar with product-led growth. So product-led growth is an end-user focused growth model that relies on the product itself as the primary driver of customer acquisition, conversion, and expansion. So with a product-led business, it's not that there are no employees, that there are no sales and marketers on staff. It just means that the product itself is doing a lot of the heavy lifting, and sales and marketing needs to approach it in a different way. I think some great examples here are obviously Datadog and Calendly, who are in our portfolio I mentioned, but also Atlassian, Dropbox, and Zoom. And why do we love product-led growth? Well, many of you guys are SaaS founders and you understand how beautiful the margins are in SaaS, but it's also the most profitable SaaS model. I need to update this because I've only updated it through 2020. But when we track the PLG index here at Openview of the public companies that are product-led versus the SaaS, all software companies, and product-led businesses are seen as much more valuable and they're much more profitable as well. Openview knows product-led growth. We've invested in a number of product-led businesses, and we continue to help our businesses that are not product-led transition to those types of models as well, if that's something they want. So in order to put this framework together and to really help founders understand where to start with product-led growth if they're not product-led, and where to invest resources versus where is it a waste of your time, I've been talking to a lot of different founders from really strong product-led businesses. So as you can see here, a number of these conversations were leveraged to create this deck. So, I don't want to say like this is all just my own thoughts. I've used a lot of very public examples as well as private conversations with those founders over time. And I want to note that not every company is going to start out as product-led, but they just want to adopt best practices. there's a ton of advice on how to start as a product-led business, but you might have a lot of traction. You might have a great sales-led model, and you may not want to let that go. And there's a lot of lessons for, being a very large company and, taking a few of those lessons and applying them because you have a ton of resources at hand. But there's not a ton out there for the messy middle. So once you have some traction, and you might want to explore this as an option with like sort of a labs approach or a growth approach. And that's where Openview likes to come in and talk to folks. So if this is interesting to you, please feel free to reach out to me directly as well on LinkedIn or via email, because this is my life. This is what I like to talk about too. So let's get started. I like frameworks. They really help me sort of organize my thoughts. So I'm going to compare, two very different frameworks that we've leveraged together to sell software. So if you think about how we used to sell software, or we still have sold software, it follows the Salesforce model very closely. And I think that Salesforce created their CRM because they knew and understood their users extremely well. But we're used to understanding sort of this prospect model where someone's sort of aware of our brand and they might potentially be a buyer. Perhaps they're in our total addressable market. They eventually become a lead when they start to engage with our brand and our content or our sales teams. Hopefully they become an opportunity if they have the budget and the willingness to pay. And then, they don't actually start interacting with the product the majority of the time until they're in a POC or a trial. And typically those POCs are very highly managed by sales or by a sales engineer. They might be very costly from a business perspective for you guys to manage. So they're highly guarded. And then finally, after the POC, the hope is that they're a closed won customer and that they stay on for a while. But as you can see, most product interaction is not occurring until later on in these stages, specifically in this traditional Salesforce-esque model. PLGs really turn that on its head. So users like myself are very used to consumerization. They're very used to just buying something on Amazon and having it show up. Or they're very used to sort of buying something at 12 o'clock at night while they're feeding their child or something like that. And that journey is very different because they start hearing about a product and then they can get started right away. And then they actually activate within the product. They find value in the product before they even talk to someone. And perhaps they talk to someone in order to convert, but it's not necessarily a requirement. And then finally, perhaps they scale and grow with that product as well, because that product develops more use cases for them, or because that product is priced and packaged in such a way that they end up paying someone more. These green dots show the order of operation and emphasize the value discovery step. You might think that you would start from the beginning and you need to get customers and get them started. But in reality, what I have found is that the best product-led businesses out there who've either started out product-led or who have transitioned to this model or taken baby steps into this model, they really focus on the product and the user discovery of value within the product before they focus on anything else. And then they go back to developing a top of funnel strategy and getting more and more folks into the product. But if the product itself doesn't actually provide any value for users and it just sort of feels weird for them to be in it without talking to someone, then even if you have an enormous top of funnel of people discovering the product, coming through the website and signing up, you're just going to have a leaky bucket. Awesome. So top companies start with their growth engine. They activate users to see value. What is activation? I think it's kind of a buzzy word right now in the software space, but not everyone knows what it is. Sometimes people confuse it with a product qualified lead. To me, it's really the aha moment, or it's where the product delivers the value that it's promised. Getting that user is not enough. You need them to see value in the product. One of my favorite quotes actually comes from Fareed, who was an early growth product manager at Slack. He said, great free products get you to some value quickly and greater value over time. So time is really of the essence in showing value in a product. So think back to the first time that you leveraged Zoom, which we're using today. The greatest thing about Zoom is that it just works. And that was probably pretty apparent to you within 15 minutes of using it, especially if you're comparing it to like a Skype or a WebEx as well. As you can see here, I have some very common activation metrics for other popular SaaS businesses today. One thing that I think is really interesting is that it's really different per business. And I think that's why a lot of folks are not measuring activation or not thinking critically about the value that they're providing to their users, is because it's a really difficult exercise to do that. And after you've discovered activation for your product, these top PLG businesses prioritize that discovery value. And then they think about how do we remove friction in the customer journey to get them started? How do we make ourselves more attractive? And that's when we come back to what I consider to be sort of the core pillars of go-to-market, those drivers to get started, the way that your product is messaged and positioned, your website design, and sometimes your web UI. Like, how do we remove friction from this process, and how do we make it really easy to be attracted to our product? And then top PLG businesses that I have found will prioritize that discovery of value, then acquisition, and then demand. So this is a little bit counterintuitive, because you might think, well, we have a product, we need to generate demand for it. But a lot of times, what I'm seeing is you need to remove friction to get into the product because it has so much value, and then generate demand. So, and one thing that I think is really interesting, especially in product-led growth, is that it's harder to do more traditional demand generation. And I think some of the founders here this might click with them, but perhaps paid marketing or things like that don't necessarily work for you if you have a free model, or you have a model where you're giving away a lot of value up front. And what I found is that, in these models, organic discovery is king. And I'm going to talk through some very specific examples of how you can drive organic discovery of your product. There's also a lot of virality that's apparent here. And, I think people talk about virality and they get excited about like the Dropbox model and referrals, et cetera. But there are a lot of other ways to generate virality for your product, which I'll talk through today as well. And then finally, making sure that you're discoverable by a user who really has a need for your tools, and making sure that you're available in that workflow. So these pieces together come and build a framework to build PLG. So, we start with activation, which is really that aha moment. Go back to the beginning and remove friction and build discoverability of our product. And then finally, once someone's actually found value in our product, we need to think really critically about how to convert them. And I'm not saying this is a no sales model, because this is where sales is really king, and this is really where they come in. And then finally, also scaling them. So after conversion, your work isn't over. Your sales or your customer success team really needs to work to expand and keep those customers, so that you have this beautiful cycle of software that's so attractive to not only investors, but also public markets as well. So now I'm going to get into the more tactical examples of, what pieces of the framework we have, and I'll start from the beginning, which is discovery. So again, to recall, discovery is how prospects will find you and your brand. So in my interviews, I found that discovery happens via early adopters. I think a lot of us are probably in that stage here where you're getting early traction from the tire kickers who will find you on Product Hunt or somewhere on social and become like your larger fans. I think there's a lot of excitement around communities, and I think communities are really full of early adopters today. Discovery can also happen via a collaborative model. So for example, like Slack or Zoom or something like that, when you're using that tool, you're collaborating with another person, and that actually builds discovery too. So as you have one user, you're getting even more because they have this viral use case. And then finally, answering users' needs is incredibly important. And I think this is where most companies struggle, because you need to be discoverable in a workflow. One of the things that I work with the most is developer-focused tooling and developer-focused companies. And I like to give Stripe as an example, because 80% of their traffic still comes from their documentation, because they've really honed themselves to be findable and discoverable within that use case of needing APIs to build payments. There are different flavors of acquisition. So when I think about early adopters, some of the approaches that I think about are building communities, but I think some really key examples and ways that you can drive this are, one of the ways is the elite approach. I've actually been getting nonstop ads for Superhuman lately, which I thought was odd. But some companies will actually create this sort of vibe or this wait list approach for influencers during early stages to build hype for the product. And I've seen that be really effective when done properly. My favorite flavor of acquisition is a viral use case. So there are a lot of different ways to be viral, and I invite you to explore Openview's blog because we go into these at length. My favorite is exposure virality. So perhaps you use Calendly, or perhaps you've received an email sent to you from someone in MailChimp or Constant Contact. You're going to see that that brand constantly as you encounter it in your day-to-day life. If I send you an invite link, it's probably from Calendly. You know, the same thing goes for Zoom. We're all seeing it right now because we're in the product. Exposure virality can be really valuable, and I think a lot of brands ignore it, or they don't necessarily think about how to build it into their product offering as it is today. The next step too is collaborative virality. So Slack is a great example of that. You actually cannot get value out of the product if you're in it alone. But there are other examples like Figma, GitHub, etc., where you can act as a single player, but you get so much more value out of the product if you have it with another person. And then finally, you know, making sure that you're discoverable in context. So a lot of developer-focused tools will do this. By being very active on various places where you're looking for solutions to engineering problems. You know, if you're looking for a solution, you might find it through documentation or support, or even a sidecar product, as Sneak might, as I'll show later on with the Sneak example. So what are some metrics and benchmarks? Well, for companies that are more likely to be product-led, we see a much higher percentage of organic traffic coming to them, because for some folks, paid marketing is really like oil and water. It doesn't work for them. Fareed, who I spoke to for this deck, said, you know, in the early days for Slack, that it didn't work for them at all, because you weren't like Googling Slack. You weren't necessarily Googling a chat product because you were new to a market. I think it's also important to call out this other box, which can be traffic coming from the product itself, or from word of mouth, or from virality. And how do you measure organic? One of the things that I think is really most challenging is saying, you know, how are we doing? Are we doing a good job of this? How well are we doing? One thing that I like to do is to measure brand. And in order to do that, I like to measure the share of voice. It's a model typically used in advertising, very old school, very Mad Men. It focuses on the weight of a topic amongst other advertisers. So what we do at Openview is we'll actually start tracking keywords that we want to rank on. For example, product-led growth, or usage-based pricing, or virality. And then we actually monitor how we rank on those terms in incognito mode on a monthly basis. And we plan all of our marketing objectives around that share of voice, and making sure that we're gaining more share of voice as well. And as this deck comes out, I'll also supply the tracker that we use. So the next step in the journey is start. It's getting that user to engage. It's getting that user, you know, once they've discovered you, how do we confirm that they will find you attractive, and that your message will resonate with them? Well, the first thing and the biggest problem that I see, even with sales-led organizations, is that the website itself does not answer the question of what's in it for me? How will this product make me better? Some of us wear Nike because it makes us feel like a better athlete. Some of us wear Allbirds because it makes us feel like we're making a difference. And software should really make us feel something, and people, you know, it should make us feel good. So, you know, one of the biggest things that I see is that websites become all about features and competitive differentiation. But in reality, it needs to be about that user and how great you make them look. So one example that I like to show is Slack during their early days. They're such a nebulous product. It's so hard to define. And I'm sure that many of you guys are in that same bucket because you have this very horizontal use case. If you look at Slack's journey, I used the Internet Wayback Machine for this, and I highly recommend that you do it for any company you admire. You start to see messages that don't really resonate and don't really stick. You know, when you think about your searchable infinite brain, that doesn't really feel like Slack to me. And perhaps it was so early they didn't know what they really had either. They start thinking about, you know, playing with customer stories and trying to build out a hero storyline. And then they get really aspirational because they talk about how they've helped put robots on Mars. But, you know, there's still a lot of jargon on the website. There's still a lot of questions that are unanswered. until now. They've started to find success. Here you are the hero because you're being asked to build stronger relationships with external partners. You start to see the product itself, and it starts to stress the value of relationships and communication, which will resonate with everyone. You actually start to see the product itself, and animations of the product in action will show us even more and really help put you in the driver's seat as a decider of whether or not this resonates with you. So, I highly recommend taking this approach with many other companies that you admire and thinking through, how can we sort of pole vault ourselves over these many, many years of messaging pain and challenges. Most startups I see say, oh, ignore the website, it's not good. But that's tough because, ultimately users who are discovering your product organically are finding it via your website as well. So how do you know if your website is good? How can you start to measure it and understand it? Well, so one of the things that Openview likes to do is we have our product benchmark survey. This data is from 2020. We found that conversion from web visit to free account sign up, if you have a freemium tool, should hover between between 5 and 7% in terms of the medians. But the best performing businesses out there are getting above 10% sign up rates. So, while conversion rates from your web to your product can vary dramatically, it's clear that high growth businesses will have a very large top of funnel to start working with from the start. So to drive that home and to really think about a framework and how do we get the message down on our website so that people get excited about our product and get started with it, is that product-led businesses tend to have their websites revolve around the user and people, not necessarily product features. We want to make them look good, and that's really all that matters. That's marketing at its core. So product-led growth is not about marketing. Great websites use what's called an inverted pyramid to tell their story. They tell the most important thing up front. And then every other piece of copy answers why this, why now. They show, don't tell. So animations and cartoons are very cute, but what's better is really the product itself because you spent so long working on it. Design should also be people focused. We've found that using photos of real people makes it easier for potential users to picture themselves using your product. And finally, fear of missing out is real. Messaging should typically imply that the smartest, most in the know people in the industry are using your product, and you want to keep up with them, so you've got to get on board.
Oh, you're really, really stepping ahead. I have a couple of questions for you in a moment,
Yeah.
but they concern the activation, so I'll wait for 1 more minute.
Well, that's where we are now. So
okay, excellent. Actually, I meant to ask already earlier, but what is it like? You had those examples of startups that have their activation metric nailed down. Is it something that they where did it come from? Was it based on metrics and a point in retention when you notice that after this point they don't drop off anymore? How do you go about finding your own activation point?
I feel like I'm paying you to ask me this, but that's what I'm going to go over next. So one of the things that I do at Openview with every new portfolio company is I actually help them find their activation metric. And I think a lot of people are very intimidated by this because it can feel like a very large data science exercise, especially if you have a lot of user data, a lot of usage data. So one of the things that I do is I put them through this framework. In order to find the product's activation, I say, okay, well, give me every action that you can take in your product. I'll typically shop it around to sales and support and say like, hey, sales guy, hey, Tom, what do you think is the most important thing that someone should be doing in your product to get value out of it? And I'll ask the same thing of, a support person as well. And that typically will give me like 5 to 6 key metrics that I think are valuable. But in order to isolate it down to one and to time box it, what I do is I put it through this framework. I'll say, is this easy to achieve by the average user? So are greater than 50% of folks who are signing up doing this? Can it be completed relatively quickly? That's highly dependent on the product. If it's a very advanced developer tool, maybe I'll give them 2 weeks. If it's something as simple as Calendly, I'll give them a week. Is it predictive of user retention? So that's not necessarily monetary retention. It just means that that user keeps coming back and taking some action in the product, so they don't just abandon it. And then is it correlated to business performance? So if you are monetizing, does it correlate to a conversion? And if you've been monetizing for a while, does it also correlate to an upgrade, or an invitation to another person, etc.? So let's use an example. This is an example product that I made up, but let's say, is there an ideal number of users added to influence conversion or predict churn? So a lot of people will say, I need a number of users added by a certain date. Is it using a feature? So in this case, it's feature XYZ. So is there a sweet spot in the number of XYZ feature uses that indicate that propensity? Or is it positive responses? So in this case, it's a survey tool that indicate propensity to convert or churn. And when I put it through my framework, it becomes super clear which one is like sort of the standout. So in this scenario, it was positive responses to a survey that was sent out. And some of the things that I found were really interesting. It can be easily achieved. It can be completed relatively quickly. And here I would actually say, okay, what's the average or the median time box in order to do that? Is it predictive of retention? So that typically separates what I call the men from the boys here. So a lot of times I'll see a metric that is not predictive of someone coming back and using the product at all. And then finally, is it correlated to business performance? Typically, companies will have that and they'll say, oh, people who do this are more likely to convert, but they won't take it further and say they're more likely to invite others. Or in this scenario, self-service accounts. We're doing that more often. So it became very clear in this scenario that positive responses framework was the right way to look at activation for this company. So let's talk about metrics and benchmarks. Activation can be really defeating in a way because not all of your users are going to get activated. In fact, fewer than half of your users are really going to get activated. What I see for multi-user products where you have to collaborate in order to get a lot of value out of it is that the activation rate hovers around 20%. So for example, like Typeform, where you're sending a survey to people and they need to return it, that's their activation rate is around 20%. For a Teams product, like a messaging tool like Slack, I'm also seeing that around 20%. For single user products where I can get value on my own, like Asana or something like that, I see it around 40%. And my favorite products, which include browser extensions, so LastPass, etc., I see above 50% activation rates there. So one of the quickest wins that you can get if you're building an activation metric, or if you want to drive activation, is to build a browser extension if your product supports it. So do we have additional questions on activation?
In between? Sorry, Sam.
Yeah.
A quick one. So since activation is really key in the whole process and sort of validates the user need, should you really do anything you can to reach that point? Do gamification or reward them in some other way, give them some other freebies just to get them over the edge to become activated, because your metrics show that after that point they are willing to commit? Or should it happen organically, that they really discover it themselves to be to be a true measure of that? And before you answer that, hey, if you remember the Q&A, if you have questions, shoot them in between. I'll take them up with Sam or then the end. But yeah, go ahead.
I'm a big believer in activation at all costs and experimentation and trying things out. I think that's why growth teams exist. Sometimes you might, teach your users the wrong things, like dark patterns. For example, Audible, who's a very consumer-focused software product, started doing very heavy discounts, and I know that they learned not to do that over time. So things like that might matter quite a bit, but for specifically gamification, or extending trials and things like that for people who are taking the right actions, I highly recommend those. I just do not recommend discounting your product or sort of cheapening your product in order to get folks to that point. But if you understand what the point is in which they see value, however you can drive them there is really important. I mean, even Airtable, who's one of the most outstanding product-led companies out there, they have entire teams of customer success managers dedicated to calling people and getting them to that activation point and getting them set up and getting them ready. And I don't think that there's any shame in that. I don't think that a product-led business means no people. It means people working together to get users to find value. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
that is interesting.
Yeah. Awesome, cool. So the next step is conversion. How do we get those users to subscribe? How do we get them to pay us? I think one thing that's really important to keep in note is that a free offering is becoming more and more common. 45% of companies in our survey had a free trial, and 18% of them had a freemium offering. So there's quite a bit of that happening. So it's not necessarily the only way that you can stand out. In fact, it's harder to stand out more so now than any other way. So how do you create a hook? How do you get folks to convert? So much of that comes from pricing and packaging. And I think a lot of these businesses really ignore pricing and packaging as a lever of growth. And I think that that's a real problem. So I think one of the earlier ways that people started to create a hook and get people to pay them when they had a product-led model is a trial. So they would drive product usage via a trial. And I do think that this works considerably for certain audiences, specifically like very small businesses, or something where you have a lot of setup required. It creates a sense of urgency for users to prove the value of their tool to their businesses in a short period of time. And we do tend to see higher conversion rates from trials. A really good hook, and I think that a lot of folks have seen this, is a volume of usage. So metricing on success, I think, is valuable. So with Wistia, it's the number of videos that you've put into the product. With HubSpot, it used to be the number of contacts that you had. So that keeps a free offering for user, or a cheap offering for users with a casual need, but it very quickly raises the ACV of folks who have a very serious professional need for that tool. Another place where I've seen this become really common is more of a pay-as-you-go, not necessarily metric on success, but in the developer tooling space, I know that developers don't want to be sidelined by contract conversations, and they want pricing that just makes sense to them and scales with their use and something they understand quickly. Twilio charges per text message or per phone call or per use of their API. And Datadog charges per logs. And they make it really simple to just put a card on file and to start charging for usage on a monthly basis. And then finally, what I see a lot of folks see or attempt is feature-based, or sometimes even seat-based. So they'll make the product free for everyone in order to get them engaged, but they'll step up pricing precipitously for power users and teams to take advantage of deeper features. And those are all very, acceptable ways to create that hook and convert folks. One thing that I would call out is to be really thoughtful about your activation metric and make sure that that's prior to the paywall, and to be really thoughtful in, how you want your business to grow. So sometimes I'll see folks charging to add additional users and things like that. But if your product is really sticky, if you have a lot of users on, then that might actually hamstring you in the long run. So you just have to think critically, sort of be thinking a few steps ahead about, how do we want users to engage with the product, and how do we build our pricing and packaging around that so that it makes them very successful. I think one of the misnomers of product-led growth is that product-led growth means you don't have sales. That's absolute garbage. And you'll never hear me say that. When I look at go-to-market motion distribution from all of the surveys that I've run, the majority of folks who have a free version are still very sales assisted in terms of conversions. So that's greater than 60% if you actually look at this. There are very, very few companies who have a very strong self-service arm, and typically they're very young because they aren't necessarily selling into the enterprise yet. I like to think of sales in a product-led business as almost like Sherpas. They're really helping someone build a case for the product internally, but that person has already seen value in the tool. Perhaps their team has already seen value in the tool, but they're really working together as a salesperson and a user to sell it into the broader organization, which, as I'm sure you guys are all aware, given sort of procurement folks and security concerns and things like that, is a really tough job where you need an experienced salesperson to help you navigate it. And I love my metrics and benchmarks. So I wanted to show you what's an expected conversion rate from a free account to a paid account. So this is for folks who have a freemium tool. Honestly, it's crushing. The web to paid conversion rates are quite low. We're typically seeing them around 9% or so from conversion from free to paid in these companies. And I can say, for very, very large public product-led organizations, it's even smaller than that. So don't hold yourself to the highest standards if you have a free product where you're converting folks to paid as well. Do you have any questions on conversion and packaging and pricing? Those typically are very top of mind for founders as well.
Yeah, no, there's one on the activation, but I'll come to that later.
Got it.
I mean,
awesome.
Your comment about the sales assisted one must maybe aimed at me, as we talked before. I was one of those persons who thought that sales doesn't really mix so well with PLG. But yeah, I saw that it's later on in the process. But I'll come back to that a little bit later. But we've got a couple of more questions coming in. Let's see if they.
Well, and on the sales front, I mean, Atlassian, for example, has like thousands and thousands and thousands of salespeople, and they're hiring dramatically. So if you think someone is no sales, because they might say they are, go on their LinkedIn and see what they really are, because sometimes they obscure that quite a bit.
Yeah. So there's a couple of actually related this one. Let me take one from Ricardo. So do you think that packages strategy is essential for pricing and sales? Or like a single let me just read this carefully so that I don't rephrase it wrongly, but maybe I'll come to this a little bit actually later. Any thinking around B2B and B2C concerning the stuff that you go through? Are there are we talking completely different things, or I mean, conversion and those must be very dependent on how consumer or B2B you are?
Well, I have a piece coming out soon on B2C consumer products. So like, think of subscription software that's typically targeted at consumers. So dating applications, Duolingo, Babbel, those types of tools. They tend to have incredible conversion rates because they focus mainly on activation. So I'm happily married and have been for a very long time, but I signed up for Tinder in order to go through their onboarding. And I'm very, very impressed by the way that they have built their paywalls and how they've built their pricing and packaging and how they really drive users to start swiping very early on. So I recommend anyone who's thinking about product and thinking about product-led growth from these audiences, not to just focus on B2B software, but also to focus on software that has a very large audience. So the Duolingos or the Tinders of the world, because they have larger groups of people to experiment on. So their findings are much more significant. And obviously, you guys are in the Nordics, so Spotify is also a really great example of people who've played around with pricing and packaging and figured out how to make it work on a local level.
Yeah. And I think I deciphered Ricardo's question and understood it finally myself. So
okay.
What do you think in PLG works better, like very super transparent pay as you go, or then like tiered packaging that you start off with free, obviously, but then you add some features, you add some limits, and then you take a higher and bigger package? Any thinking around that?
I mean, I'm going to give you a crappy answer, but it's really dependent on the product. So one of the first projects that I worked with was pricing and packaging for Calendly. And like, you don't want to pay per meeting because it's just annoying and you don't really know how many meetings you're going to have. So like the pay as you go pricing for Calendly would be silly. And like our surveys showed that. However, one of the things that we did was we made it feature-based because some people are extreme power users of Calendly. But instead of making it free and then just having these packages, we wanted everyone to start out and feel like a power user of Calendly. So we actually combined these two, a trial and a feature-based packaging, where you start out on the highest end of the package and on a trial, on a 2-week trial. So you experience the best of Calendly and you learn how to be a Calendly power user from day one. And then you come back to the free tool if you don't like it, or you're not seeing the value in it, or you're not willing to pay. And that's increased conversion really dramatically. So I think that, you need to like look at products that are somewhat adjacent. You need to think about your users and how they prefer to buy. I see pay-as-you-go being most common in the developer-focused tooling space. But for other tools, sometimes it's a mix of these different flavors too.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that's good advice. And there's a couple of other things. I think maybe if we just continue and go through the full framework and then come back to a couple of these questions, because these are like bigger topics. Yeah.
Well, the last one is scale. How do we drive continuous user delight? One of the biggest questions I get is, what should I focus on post-purchase? Retention is important. And I think in traditional software, retention has always been king. You created entire customer success organizations to make sure that people will keep their annual contracts. But one thing that's really interesting now is expansion, specifically as you build more product offerings, as you price and package differently. How much can the company grow, and how much wallet share can someone get from their existing customers? The question is always, what should your team tackle first? I see lower expansion rates in businesses that sell to very small businesses and small businesses. So if you tend to sell to those audiences, I would say focus on making sure the product retains those users. But if you're, and these things are typically measured by net dollar retention, which I will go into as well. So I like to give this example. In venture, you might come across two companies growing at an attractive rate, but the way that they handle retention and expansion can make or break the business. So if you look at them, they're continuously growing new business 5% month over month. But company A loses 5% of their MRR per month to churn, and company B only loses 3%. In the following quarter, company A is almost flatlining. They're dropping significantly in terms of MRR, but company B, because they've reduced churn significantly less than company A, is actually still growing. So they do not have that leaky bucket problem. Even though they both began the year in the same place, company B is going to look much more attractive to venture capitalists given the state of their retention metrics. Retention is key to building an enduring software business, especially for businesses with a free trial or freemium motion, but it can be really difficult. So when I look at net dollar retention rates on an annual basis, if you're selling to very small businesses and small businesses, what I see in terms of benchmarks is that net dollar retention at around 95 to 98%, which is still quite low. Best in class PLG businesses that are going public and things like that are hovering in the 120% range. I also would like to caveat this with saying, if you are selling to developers, net dollar retention tends to be higher for developer focused tools. And I've actually written a developer go-to-market playbook, which you can Google and find. It's crazy how loyal developers are to their software tooling compared to the broader software market. So I encourage you to look at that as well. But how do you retain users? Outside of building an awesome product that everyone wants to use all the time, some examples that I've found are Asana has this very sophisticated health scoring model where they take a number of product inputs to create a health pulse, and that's actually linked in here as well, and creates a 360-degree view of the customer so that any CS manager can see that and put people in different campaigns based on that health score. One of the best ways to make sure that your retention is strong is to have really strong onboarding. So I mentioned the Airtable example before, where they're driving users to engage with the product. They have CSMs who really try and meet in person with folks to engage with them during onboarding. Datadog does the same thing. They drive adoption and they assign customer success managers to new enterprise accounts with like a very specific plan up front. That's just like another sales contract to get them up and running appropriately. And then HubSpot, who's a little bit more mature, actually has user groups in individual cities. Maybe they have one in Helsinki that enable folks to learn from one another and to support one another too. And finally, if you are interested in expansion, which you should be, making sure that you have strong monetization paths is really key. So Help Scout was a great example. They actually keep sales in the loop for their larger accounts for up to 12 months so that they will find opportunities to expand their accounts. Sales tends to do a better job of expansion than customer success because that's just who they are and that's their personality type. MongoDB, they've really tied their growth to their customer growth. So as customers grow, as they expand and have more clusters, their revenue expands naturally. Datadog's really interesting in that they've developed for user need. They began with a singular product, but they have a ton of offerings now, a full suite of tools. So they've started to capture those adjacent jobs by those users and the adjacent needs too. And then finally, Atlassian is sort of a one-off example, but they've really developed M&A around capturing more share of these tech companies' wallets. They identify adjacent products, people and teams that would best serve their existing base, and they've done a really great job of swallowing up those markets as well. So that's sort of my spiel and how we go through the entire product-led model. I wanted to call out the fact that activation is still really king, but all of these steps are important. These make a little bit, I hope these make a little bit more sense to you guys now in terms of what to focus on first. I meet public companies on a day-to-day basis who still are not thinking about pricing and packaging in a programmatic way, and they're certainly not thinking about scale either. So, making sure that you focus on these 3 steps first is really key, and making sure, one of the hardest parts of being a founder is the shiny object syndrome and not getting distracted. So my goal is to really provide this as a resource to help you understand where to prioritize as well.
Great. It certainly did to me. So a couple of more questions coming your way.
Awesome.
So on the activation metric, what do you views on like choosing a very simple one and not trying to over-engineer it? This one from Philip. So how complex or uncomplex should you make it? How much science should go in there?
I'm a huge fan of reducing complexity, especially if it helps your team sort of rally around what I consider to be a North Star metric. Fareed, who I interviewed at length for this deck from Slack, said that he believes that companies should only be measuring 5 things. So I'm a huge fan of reducing complexity as well. As long as your support team or sort of the office manager at your company can explain why it's important to get users to that point, to me, that means it's a really awesome activation metric. If it's a score that is like weighted or something like that, and you have to have it on a board or like a calculator to do it, I feel like it's much too complicated and it's going to be really challenging to get anyone besides a product manager to understand.
Yeah, good, excellent. A couple of small ones as tasters. So I think it relates to the numbers that, and maybe they can be found on your website, but the numbers that you show regarding conversion and all these metrics numbers, how are they relevant for all? What is the N that you surveyed? Are they relevant?
Our N is up to, our N is up to 500. And if you go to productbenchmarks.com, you can actually put in your own data and compare it to your peers. So Openview's benchmarks is our most important piece of content that we put out every year. I put out the product benchmarks every year in June or July. So we've done that for 2 years now, which leads to a data set of around 500. And then we also have been doing our financial and operating benchmarks, which we put out every fall. It's coming out in November. And we've done that for 5 years now. So if you Google SaaS benchmarks, that will be the first thing that comes up.
Okay. So Michael, there
you
go.
And we have data explorers for both, so you can compare yourself to your peers or to a larger data set.
Excellent. And then on one more on the numbers, Ilya here calculated that the sort of the metrics where you had the visitor to free and free to paid conversion, they ended up somewhere like 5% times 9% would be a result 0.5% approximately. Is that the reality where we have to live in?
Yes. So there's a really helpful, I'm a very visual learner. The 2020 product benchmarks shows this side by side. Yes, it is the reality that we need to live in. Especially like as you grow and scale and as you become more discoverable. For example, SurveyMonkey has public data around their conversion rates and it's sub 1%. But they just have so many people signing up for their product, it doesn't necessarily matter. And those are the people that it works best for, and they tend to have very large ACVs.
Excellent. And then see, we still have time. Well, yes, we do. So maybe, do you see the Q&A yourself? There's one linked question here, which is maybe if you can take the one from Martin and Marcus combined, the most upvoted ones. And please do upvote those questions so we know which order.
Yeah, so what are my favorite strategies to prevent account sharing in a B2B context? Would you prefer the pricing strategy of one cheaper license per person or one more expensive license per company? That's a really good question. I haven't really come across any sort of like across the board great strategies. I hate using Salesforce because there are so many factors that go into it because they do price per seat. It's very uncomfortable for me as an end user. I would prefer a pricing strategy that makes it easier for an end user to engage with a product comfortably. So, you know, if that pricing strategy is just one more expensive license per company, so be it. Because it's just so brutal as an end user that I don't even want to sign into Salesforce these days. If that helps you with anything. What are the first steps for moving from a sales assisted model to a pure self-serve model would I recommend? So we were talking about this prior to the call. I love the HubSpot model. Maybe it's because I'm in Boston. Maybe it's because I know a bunch of people who work there. They started with adjacent product offerings. So they had their core marketing automation tool that was always quite expensive, always quite sales led, but they came out with their Sidekick product. They came out with their marketing website grader. They came out with their CRM, and those were all sort of adjacent products. They were folks who were going to be talking to the marketers at the organization, and they were free. And they were not distractions for the organization because ultimately they kept their sales team focused on the marketing CRM. But their product organization was able to be flexible and to really learn with training wheels on how to build these offerings and how to build self-service in a way that was not distracting to the broader go-to-market team. So that's my favorite recommendation that I would use is to take a look at HubSpot. Yeah.
I mean, that is, I think this one is very relevant for most of the audience here, as they already probably have a sales model and they're thinking that how can I try this without completely ruining my business? But maybe, do you have any examples of where it has gone wrong? Maybe as you showed all the right way to do it, but just to get a little contrast on how not to do it then. Have you seen things go horribly wrong when somebody tried to move to a PLG model?
Yeah, I have. I'm not going to call anyone out directly because I'm a nice person.
You know.
However, I've seen in the security space specifically, people just feel like throwing a crappy like demo product and calling it a free trial or calling it a freemium product will help them with lead generation, which is fine. Like if I want to feel and touch the product, fine. But I feel like it actually impacts your brand if you have a product that's lovely. And you have a product that really solves a real problem for a user, and then you put something out there that doesn't actually do any of those things. I think that actually hurts you in the long term because someone's going in expecting to have that delightful experience or expecting to have their promises answered because they had such a delightful experience in the marketing website. And then they go into this product and they're like, ew, this is gross. Like, this isn't really working for me. I think that can hurt your brand more than it helps you with the demand generation.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it sounds obvious, but only afterwards, I guess.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a lesson that you learn over time. And I am very lucky in that I get to talk to practitioners who have learned their lessons. And I would always recommend that people go and look at very mature product-led organizations too and see what they've changed. I like to look at Dropbox quite a bit because they're undergoing significant organizational changeover right now, because they've gone into a lot of dark behavior patterns and they've tried to optimize so much that they're peeling things back now. And they have many years of churn data and they have many years of ACV data and they have so much data that I'm learning from them over time of like what works and what doesn't. And I'm hoping to apply those lessons to portfolio companies as well.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, really good. Hey, we've got one more from Tarmo here. Can you give a look at the Q&A?
Yeah, what is a good month over month or CMGR for usage-based pricing model companies when they're around 500K to $1 million in ARR volume size? Yeah, so I'm going to give you a sneak peek. We're releasing usage-based pricing benchmarks next month. So keep an eye on Openview's website. My partner, Kyle Poyer, who's the operating partner for the growth team, he is the usage-based pricing god, like that's his thing. So he's going to answer this question in approximately 3 weeks. So I'm gonna, if you want to sign up, you'll get a sneak peek there too.
Excellent, that's good. Yeah. And also, like the Openview site is a treasure chest of all things PLG. So definitely head over there and read some of the stuff. It's really well written. So highly recommend it.
Yeah, and our financial and operating benchmarks are not just PLG. We sometimes have a flavor, but I highly recommend you check them out when they come out in November as well. And then we are doing our very first usage-based pricing benchmarks too. So
perfect. Hey, thank you very much, Sam, for this great PLG dive. And yeah, we'll speak soon again.
Great. Thank you guys. Appreciate it. Have a wonderful evening.
Yeah, you too.